Oh, this is better. Thank you for showing up in such overwhelming numbers compared to yesterday. म छोटो एउटा परिचय चाहिँ नेपालीमा दिन्छु, त्यसपछि हामी यो कुराकानी चाहिँ अङ्ग्रेजीमा गर्छौँ। सुरुमा सबैलाई स्वागत छ। हाम्रो काई बर्ड चाहिँ नेपाल र दक्षिण एसियासँग परिचित हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँले इन्डियाको कोडाइकनाल तमिलनाडुमा पढ्नुभएको। उहाँको बुवा कूटनीतिज्ञ हुनुहुन्थ्यो, अमेरिकी कूटनीतिज्ञ। त्यसमा हुनाले संसारभरि घुम्न पाउनुभयो र इन्डियामा हुँदाखेरि उहाँ 19 वर्षको उमेरमा 19 राइट काई when you were 19 या 19 वर्षको उमेरमा नेपाल पहिलोचोटि आउनुभएको। त्यसपछि धेरैचोटि आइसक्नुभयो र पछि गएर 4 वर्ष 2063 देखि 67 सम्म चाहिँ काठमाडौँमै बस्नुभयो। उहाँको श्रीमती वर्ल्ड ब्याङ्कमा खटिएपछि काठमाडौँ नेपालमा उहाँले त्यसपछि भारतमै बसेर पत्रकारिता गर्नुभयो अमेरिकी पत्रिकाहरूको लागि। र पछि गएर उहाँको लेखन चाहिँ जीवनीमा, खास गरी जीवनीहरूमा केन्द्रित भयो। र त्यही सिलसिलामा हामी आज कुरा गर्न गइराखेको किताब चाहिँ अमेरिकन प्रोमेथियस। यो चाहिँ अमेरिकाको आणविक वैज्ञानिक ओपेनहाइमरको बारेमा हो, उहाँको जीवनीको बारेमा। र किताब निस्केको त 18 वर्ष भइसक्यो। इट वाज 18 years ago that the book came out. 18 वर्ष अगाडि किताब निस्क्यो, अलिअलि हलचल भयो, तर त्यस्तो खास गरी त्यस्तो ठुलो कुरा भएन। तर साँच्चीकै पोहोर साल ओपेनहाइमर भन्ने सिनेमा निस्केपछि चाहिँ यो चाहिँ संसारभरि, सिनेमा त अब सबैले हेर्नुभएको थियो होला। कतिजनाले ओपेनहाइमर सिनेमा हेऱ्यो यहाँ? People who saw the movie. कतिजनाले किताब पढ्यो? People who read the book. Okay, 3, 4. Okay. All right, so you can see the power of Hollywood and movies. तर त्यो पोहोर साल त्यो सिनेमा निस्केपछि चाहिँ किताबको बारेमा ठुलो चर्चा भयो र अझ धेरै किताब चाहिँ बिक्यो पनि, नेपालमा पनि बिक्यो र खास गरी पोखरामा आउनु आँट्नु भएको भन्ने थाहा पाएपछि त झन् धेरै बिक्यो। उहाँको यो ओपेनहाइमरको जीवनीको सन्दर्भ चाहिँ अहिले आएर खास गरी संसारभरि आणविक हतियार र युद्धले ल्याउन सक्ने भयावह स्थिति संसारभरि नै, यसको बारेमा हामीलाई घचघचाउँछ। यो पढ्दाखेरि हरेक लाइनको बिचमा हामीले त्यो स्मरण गर्नुपर्छ र हामी विचार गरौँला नेपालमा के असर पर्छ त यसले। यो ओपेनहाइमर अमेरिकासँग आणविक हतियार छ, नेपाललाई के, हामीलाई के वास्ता? तर नेपाललाई वास्ता गर्नुपर्ने धेरै कारणहरू छन्। पहिलो त हाम्रो 3टा छिमेकी राष्ट्रहरू तिनटैको आणविक हतियार छन् र त्यो आणविक हतियारलाई पठाउने मिसाइलहरू पनि छन्। इन्डिया, चीन र भारत, चीन र पाकिस्तान। र यिनीहरू तिनटै देश फेरि एक आपसमा त्यति मिल्दोजुल्दो छैनन् भने कुराकानी पनि गर्दैनन् धेरै। र टाइममा उनीहरूको सिमानामा लडाइँ पनि भइरहेको छ। त्यो एउटा कारण हाम्रै छिमेकीमा भयो हुनाले। अर्को कारण चाहिँ अहिले नेपालीहरू जहाँ जहाँ छन् र जहाँ जहाँ संसारमा युद्ध हुन्छ नेपालीहरू त्यसमा फस्छन्। हामीले युक्रेनमै देख्यौँ, अस्ति इजरायलमा हमासले 10 जना नेपालीहरू मारे। अफगानिस्तानमा लडाइँ हुँदाखेरि 12 जना नेपालीहरू कैनेडियन एम्बेसीमा मारिए। त्यसैले जहाँ जहाँ युद्ध हुन्छ नेपालीहरू त्यसको चपेटामा पर्छन्। र आणविक युद्ध चाहिँ यति नजिक आइसक्यो, यो खास गरी युक्रेनको युद्धपछि र इरान र इजरायलको लडाइँपछि कि हामीलाई एकदम सतर्क हुन त्यसले सिकाएको छ। एउटा अनौठोको सन्दर्भ के भयो भने इन्डियाले आणविक परीक्षण गरेको ठाउँको नाम कसलाई सम्झना छ? र हामी अहिले कहाँ छौँ? पोखरणबाट पोखरा आइपुग्यौँ। So India's first atomic test happened in a place called Pokhran in the Rajasthan desert. And we're now in Pokhara. What is your first memory of Pokhara when you first came here many years ago?
Well, can you hear me? I'm delighted to be here in Nepal and particularly Pokhara. It's sort of my second home, Nepal. We lived in Kathmandu for 4 years, 2007 to 11. But I first came to Pokhara in 1973. And I remember jumping into the lake and going swimming. And then many years later, I landed in Pokhara Airport before the new airport was built with my son, and we were going on a trek, and this small plane was going to take us up to Jomson, this very small runway, and I pointed out to my son, suddenly I said, "Hey, look what the pilot is doing." On this, before we boarded this small plane, propeller plane, the pilot got out of the cockpit and sacrificed a goat and poured the blood on the propeller. Which was probably a good thing, because landing in Jomson Airport on that small runway, it was pretty scary. I think we needed the gods to watch over us.
Yeah, in your book, we talk about the proliferation of nuclear weapons and how that is very relevant for us in Nepal, because even a tactical nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, which are not friendly countries, could have a fallout that the prevailing winds will bring up to Nepal and to the Himalaya. And Amitav Ghosh, the author, wrote a book called Countdown, in which he specifically mentions that radioactive fallout from an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange falling in the Himalayan glaciers will actually contaminate with radioactivity water that flows down rivers in Asia. And I can't help but thinking, as we are here and we see all this pollution, 70% of which is actually fallout from India, industrial pollution, which is blocking the mountains, which we can't see, and which in 1973, when you came, you probably could see very well. So do you think the book has relevance for small countries like Nepal?
Oh, absolutely. It's just, the book came out in 2005, but the film by Christopher Nolan has given it a sort of a second life, and indeed given it an international audience. And I think it's so relevant because we have become complacent, living with the atomic bomb for nearly 8 decades. And, the last nuclear weapon used in combat was on Nagasaki. And you might think that is reason for reassurance. It hasn't been used in all these decades, but I argue that 80 years is just a drop in the ocean of time. And here in Nepal, indeed, your neighbors, China and Pakistan and India, all have these dangerous weapons. And Oppenheimer, in 1945, 3 months after Hiroshima, he gave a number of speeches, one in particular in October of 45, in which he warned, that these are weapons for aggressors. These are weapons of terror. Their only purpose is terror. They're not military weapons. And you think that, he then went on to say, you may think that this is a very expensive weapon because we spent $2 billion on it. In fact, they are cheap. And any country, however poor, that decides they want to acquire these weapons will be able to do so. There are no secrets. The physics is known. It's just a manufacturing process. And of course, he was predicting our world today, where North Korea has a weapon, and Pakistan and India, and Israel and France and England and maybe tomorrow Iran. So we live in very dangerous times. And I'm grateful to Christopher Nolan for making this film to draw attention both to the book but to the issue.
You specialize in writing biographies, and I mentioned this in the introduction as well in Nepali, but why biographies? What drew you to biographies from journalism?
Yes, I started out as a journalist here in South Asia, writing for the Far Eastern Economic Review based in Hong Kong. But I drifted into biography almost by accident. I decided I wanted to write a book, and it became a biography, and I fell in love with the genre. Biography is the most powerful vehicle for conveying history. History books are okay, but I would argue that biography, if written well, is a page turner. It's about one life, and we're all curious about each other's lives and journeys. And biography is also the most arduous scholarship, I would argue, because it's just an endless quest for facts about another person's life. And it's almost novelistic, I will confess. It's my biography of Robert Oppenheimer, my take on his life, but it's written with hundreds of footnotes. So each quote, each fact has to have a footnote. So most biographies take at least 5 years, but they, if done well, they read like a novel.
It seems like it's really investigative journalism. But why Oppenheimer? How did that come about? And I understand you have a co-author, you had a co-author. So was he already working on the book and you tagged along, or what happened?
Yes, I just tagged along, actually. No, Marty Sherwin is no longer with us. He died in October of 21, just 2 weeks after learning that Christopher Nolan was finally going to make the film. But Marty had started the book in 1980, signed a contract with Knopf, and he spent 20 years researching. And then he came to me and he asked me to join him. And he argued that if I did not join him on this project, his gravestone was going to read, "He took it with him." He had gotten sort of biographer's disease, which is when you can't start to write because you know there's always one more archive, one more interview to be done. So when I joined, it stimulated him to start writing, and it turned into a great collaboration. But it still took 5 years of my time to see the book through to publication.
What fascinated you about Oppenheimer? I mean, the person, besides the scientist.
Oppie was his nickname, and he's a really complex person. He's a quantum physicist in his early 20s, on the cusp of this new science in the 1920s. But he's also, we argue in the book that he's a particularly good scientist because he also is a humanist. He loves literature, poetry. He loves T.S. Eliot's poems, John Donne. He loves the novels of Ernest Hemingway. And he even loves, he has a curiosity in his late 20s, early 30s about the Hindu scriptures. So he learns Sanskrit so that he can read the Gita in the original. This is in like 1930, 31. He's a very complex, curious personality, very intense. And I see most of you have seen the film, and it captures his intensity, this drive, this intense intelligence, and his complex relationships with other human beings and women, and his politics. And so it's a great story, and he is, of course, the father of the atomic bomb. He gave us this atomic age, which we will always be living in. So I don't know. You know, Christopher Nolan has recently been interviewed, and he routinely refers to Oppenheimer as the most important man who ever lived. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, I don't know, maybe he's promoting his film a little bit. But when you think about it, the man who gave us the atomic age in the great sweep of human history is certainly one of the most important men to have ever lived.
Um, Oppenheimer was also a linguist, as you pointed out. He started studying Sanskrit because it was difficult. He liked to do difficult things. And he seems, there was a quote from him in the book when he was, ask me a question in Latin and I'll answer in Greek. So that's the kind of...
Said that to a classmate, you know, when he was like 10 or 11 years old.
Oh, that was 10? Okay.
Yes.
And when he was 12, he applied, he sent a proposal to the American Geological Society about studying rocks, and they invited him to give a lecture. And when they found out he was 12 years old, they apparently...
A little embarrassed. They had to get a wooden box for him to stand on so that he could see over the lectern.
So he actually gave a lecture.
He actually gave a lecture. Yes.
12.
12 years
So
old.
obviously a child prodigy, but a difficult person, as we heard. And you also mentioned the Bhagavad Gita and how Oppenheimer seemed to know it by heart, especially some of the stanza that seem to describe the Almighty, the power of the sun, the light. And one particular line, which I cannot recite in Sanskrit because I can't speak Sanskrit, which is quoted in the movie, is just after the explosion. He
says, I am death, destroyer of worlds. But actually, we know at the actual time of the Trinity test, he turned to his brother, his younger brother Frank, and he simply said, it worked. And then a few days later, he's being interviewed by a New York Times reporter, and Oppenheimer had a sort of theatrical, dramatic flair. He knew what was a good quote, and he dragged this piece of scripture out.
So he used the translation from Sanskrit to English in which he says, I am death, the destroyer of worlds. But the word in Sanskrit, in the original slok, is kala. Now kal can be either time or death. So whether the Bhagavad Gita's writers meant it as time or death, but either way, it seems to make sense because Oppenheimer is saying, I am time, I am the destroyer of worlds, because time destroys. As you can see from these mountains, they're not permanent. Time destroys them. It erodes them away. Going back to the Bhagavad Gita stanza, in the movie, what perplexed me is what Christopher Nolan did, and maybe you can explain this. Why did he use this sloka in the most intimate scene, which, by the way, was censored in Nepal? We couldn't watch it.
The sex scene.
Why in that scene?
I don't think Nolan understood how controversial that might be. He was trying, you know, it's a 3-hour movie, and it covers a lot of ground. It moves very fast. And he wanted to get in a scene of Oppenheimer's reading Sanskrit, reading the Gita. And he also was trying to explain Oppenheimer's love life and his love affair with this young woman who was studying to become a psychiatrist. And so he combined the two. And I don't think he knew how controversial it would be
Didn't you tell him not to do it?
I'm sorry?
Did you tell him not to do it?
No, I did not. I did not. I
Yeah.
saw the screenplay. I read the screenplay before he started shooting. And I was looking for, large historical inaccuracies. And I found one historical inaccuracy, and I made one suggestion, and he agreed to both of them. But I let the sex scene stand.
We didn't see it here anyway, so we don't know what you're talking about. But the book comes out in 2005. The movie comes out in 2023. In between, there were several scripts written. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes. Well, this just underscores what an achievement Nolan had with this film. It was very difficult to do, and 3 different parties before he came along attempted to turn this book into a film, and they all failed. They couldn't make it work. They couldn't sell it. Some of the scripts were just awful. One of them was pretty good, I thought, but even then it couldn't capture the attention of one of the Hollywood studios, and it was an expensive film to make and cost over $100 million.
It made $1 billion.
But it made $1 billion, and that too, I think, is a miracle. A movie with an R rating about quantum physics and the making of the atomic bomb and this horrendous kangaroo court of a trial where Oppenheimer is brought down, humiliated, only 9 years after being celebrated as America's most famous scientist. 9 years later, he's destroyed in this curious, bizarre political trial. And again, I think that's one of the important reasons. Sorry. That's one of the important reasons why Marty Sherwin and I spent 25 years together working on this book. It's not just the story of the atomic bomb. What makes it important is what happened to Oppenheimer after the atomic bomb is invented, and the fact that he becomes the chief celebrity victim of the McCarthy era. And for here, a Nepali audience, you can learn a lot about American politics and history from reading this book. It explains the sort of vicious, divisive nature of our politics, and it explains our politics today, I would argue, because I would argue that the era of Donald Trump and his divisive politics has its roots in the McCarthy era and what happened to Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because that's the other relevance of the book and movie. Is not just about the danger of all-out nuclear war, but also this intolerance of a different political ideology and the persecution and the extent to which governments will go to persecute someone who has a different point of view. You see this happening not just in your country, but in our neighborhood and around the world today. Can you talk a little bit about that and the dangers of populism destroying democracy?
No, it's what happened to Oppenheimer in the 50s was terrible. I mean, many ordinary Americans their lives were destroyed. School teachers, civil servants, and they were questioned about their associations with the Communist Party. And in the case of Oppenheimer, he indeed, as an intellectual, as a professor at Berkeley in the 1930s, he was rather apolitical. He was a physics professor. But Jean Tatlock, the first love of his life, was a member of the Communist Party and nagged Oppenheimer to become more politically aware and more involved. This is the height of the Depression. Capitalism seems not to be working. And so indeed, Oppenheimer became a little more politically active, and he contributed money to activities of the Communist Party, like desegregating the public swimming pool in Berkeley. really minor stuff. And we argue in the book that he never actually joined the Communist Party, but he was indeed pink, but not red. And but all of this history, these personal associations, came to haunt him later when America went through a period of political hysteria, worrying about communism abroad, worrying that the Russians in 1949 had acquired possession of their own atomic bomb. And this led to a witch hunt and sort of an insecurity and paranoia about internal subversion. And we're going through a similar period today where people's integrity and honesty are being questioned, and it's an ugly sort of brand of populist politics that questions the other, that questions immigrants, that questions the influence of foreigners. Like Donald Trump keeps talking about China, the threat of China, and I argue it's something that America and I think many societies go through every few decades, and it's a sign of insecurity. And Oppenheimer was just the opposite. He was a man of science. He was a man who believed in universal human rights and attributes. He believed that human beings across borders should be able to cooperate and exchange intellectual property. And but there's alas, we're living through a time, I think globally, not just in America, a time of sort of anti-intellectualism, anti-globalism. And I'm hopeful that it's just a phase, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, let's hope so. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. Please keep them with you. We'll be addressing questions at the end. We'll have 15 minutes for that. Just to get back to Oppenheimer as a physicist. He's a brilliant physicist. He's designed this bomb, and yet he's unsure of himself about whether the bomb will actually ignite the atmosphere. And there's a scene in the movie, which I think is also alluded to in the book, his conversation with Einstein. Can you go into that a bit?
Yes. Well, they did seriously worry for a few weeks. Edward Teller, one of the physicists at Los Alamos, where they were building the gadget, did some calculations and suggested that there was a small chance that when they tested an atomic weapon at Trinity in the New Mexico desert, it might have a chain reaction that would ignite the oxygen in the atmosphere and burn up the entire world. And Oppenheimer took this seriously, and he got on a train immediately and went back east. Actually, he did not go back to Princeton, where Albert Einstein was. He went to Michigan and consulted a different physicist. But Nolan, for reasons of not introducing too many more characters, there are already enough characters in the film, he had him go back to consult with Einstein about this. And again, this is a little, taking a little liberties in the film, but this is not an improbable conversation. They could have talked about this. They were friends. And so it was a serious worry for a moment, but Oppenheimer was reassured very quickly that the chances were near zero.
So the bomb goes off in Hiroshima on August 5th, 1945.
August 6th.
August 6th. And Oppenheimer actually felt that one demonstration bomb would actually be a deterrent. And the devastation and the spectacular nature of the destruction would actually deter the world from future use of nuclear weapons. That's partly happened because, as you said, for 75 years there hasn't been nuclear weapon used in war. But he was against using it in Nagasaki.
He actually participated in some of the early meetings to decide how to use, whether a demonstration on an uninhabited island, for instance, could work. And he actually argued that this would not be an effective demonstration. And there's a line in the movie which actually comes right out of the book where, he says, humanity will not understand the ferocity of this weapon unless they see how horrible it is used in combat. So he was resigned to its use in the war. And he actually feared, that if it was not demonstrated, that the next war would be fought by 2 or 3 adversaries, all of whom would be armed with nuclear weapons, and that would be, Armageddon. That would be a terrible. But I want to say, what makes him really interesting as a man, as a physicist who was capable of building this terrible weapon, he at the same time was extremely troubled in a very existential way about what he knew were going to be the results. So here's a scene that is not in the movie but is in the book. I interviewed his secretary, who was still alive in 2003, and she happened to live just a mile or 2 down the road from me in Washington, D.C. And she told me the following story. She said she was walking to work. Her name is Ann Wilson. She was walking to work with Oppenheimer one day in Los Alamos, and this is in July after the Trinity test, July of 45, and suddenly she hears Oppenheimer muttering to himself, "Those poor little people, those poor little people." And she stops him and says, "Robert, what are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, we now know the gadget works. It's been tested at Trinity. And now we know it's going to be used on a whole city because there's no military target large enough otherwise. And the victims are going to be women and children and old men, very few soldiers." He knew. So when I told this story to Marty Sherwin later in the day, he said, that's very interesting because that's the same week, we know chronologically, that Oppenheimer was briefing the bombardiers who are going to be on the Enola Gay that was going to drop the first atomic bomb. And he was instructing them exactly at what altitude it should be released and at what altitude it should be ignited to have the most damaging.
Explain that.
Well, I would come back in a way to the Gita and the story of Arjun about as he's about to go into battle to kill his own relatives, and he's doing his duty, and yet he's painfully aware of the consequences. And I think Oppenheimer identified exactly that way. He was going to do this. You could not stop the science. This weapon was going to be produced. It had to be demonstrated to show its ferocity. And yet he was weeping inside for the victims.
गीताको कथा चाहिँ ओपनहाइमरलाई किन त्यस्तो सान्दर्भिक लाग्यो भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ तीबाट अलिकति झल्किन्छ. And then Oppenheimer goes to meet President Truman, and Truman calls him a crybaby.
This is in the movie, of course, and it's in the book, and it's heavily footnoted. We know this meeting happened, and Oppenheimer saw it as an opportunity to warn President Truman about the dangers of this weapon and the need to control this new technology, to ban the weapon, to engage in international talks with the Russians and others to control the technology and create an international atomic agency that would have the right to inspect factories and laboratories anywhere to make sure that bombs were not being built. Truman didn't get it. And Truman interrupted him one point and said, well, Dr. Oppenheimer, when do you think the Russians are going to get this weapon? Oppenheimer says, well, sir, I'm not sure, but in a few years. And Truman interrupts again and says, well, I know, never. Well, of course, Oppenheimer at that moment knows that the President of the United States does not understand that anyone can build this weapon. There are no secrets to it anymore, and it is cheap. And of course the Russians are going to get it, and others. And so, at that moment, Oppenheimer, he loses it. He says exactly the wrong thing to the President of the United States, who made the decision to use 2 weapons on 2 Japanese cities. And he says, well, sir, you don't understand. I have blood on my hands, or we have blood on our hands. And of course, the meeting ends abruptly, and Truman walks out and says to his aide, I don't want to see that crybaby scientist ever again.
The book and the movie do not really address the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I guess it was beyond what you were trying to do with this, with your biography. And the book itself was translated into Japanese.
Yes.
There is still a sensitivity about the 2 bombs killing all these Japanese people. And the movie has not yet been shown in Japan.
I think it is about to. I think.
But it took a year.
It took at least, it's been 7, 8 months now, right? No, I think there was a hesitancy. It's a very sensitive subject. And it's true, the film, in the book, we do describe what happens on the ground in Hiroshima. We describe the victims. We think almost 250,000 people died as a result of these 2 bombs, and most of them were civilians. In the movie, you do not see what happened on the ground, but I think Nolan did something even better in a way, because he forces the audience to see Oppenheimer imagining sitting in a movie theater watching news clips about the destruction of Hiroshima, and you can see Oppenheimer flinching, and that forces everyone in the audience to imagine for themselves what had happened. And then there's another scene where he's giving this victory speech, and then he suddenly has a hallucination, and he sees a woman in the audience in front of him, and her face melting. By the way, that woman who's playing that, the actress playing that part, is Christopher Nolan's own daughter. Nice little detail. But anyway, so I think the film conveys and forces the audience to imagine the terribleness of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but you don't see the visuals.
Yeah, we talk about nuclear deterrence, and in a way it has worked, because the horror and the ferocity of the destruction is keeping people, even when they go to conventional war, but there are threats. Vladimir Putin has threatened to use tactical weapons in Ukraine, nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But do you think this deterrence thing is a bit of a distraction? Because non-nuclear conventional weapons have proven to be as destructive, dangerous, deadly. And even during the Second World War, we had the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed more people in one night than Hiroshima, or Dresden in Germany. So, I mean, this goes to the heart of the whole conflict and violence that is inbuilt. It seems to be hardwired in the human brain. So how do we look at deterrence then?
No, that's true. The firebombing killed more people in Tokyo than were killed in Hiroshima. But what is, it is particularly awesome that one bomb, one weapon dropped by one bomber flying 20,000 feet up in the air, invisible, can destroy a whole city with just one weapon. And this is why it's a weapon of terror. It's a weapon for terrorists. And Oppenheimer understood this, that it was not just state actors who were going to have this weapon and use it, possess it as a means of inflicting psychological terror. But he warned, amazingly enough, in 1945, he warned of the dangers of non-state actors. A terrorist group acquiring elements of enriched uranium or medical radioactive waste and packing conventional explosives around it. You can create a, quote, dirty bomb. And so in 1947, he was at a Senate hearing being questioned, and he was asked by a U.S. senator, well, sir, what is the defense if someone gets an atomic device or a dirty bomb and puts it in a suitcase or a boxed crate and puts it aboard a freighter and smuggles it into New York City harbor? What is the defense? And so Oppenheimer answered very flippantly. He said, well, sir, you could get a screwdriver.
What does it mean?
A screwdriver to open up every crate and every suitcase coming into New York harbor, i.e. there is no defense. And what's interesting about this testimony is that it stimulated the U.S. government to make a study of the threat of nuclear terrorism. And that report, we know, was written back in the early 1950s. It's still classified. We can't read it in the public, but it is known in the business as the screwdriver report.
Okay, just before we go to questions, I just wanted to ask you, what next for you, Kai? What biography are you working on now?
Yes, well, I'm bored unless I'm working on a biography. So I'm exhausted at the end of every book, but inevitably I get bored and I land on another project. And so I'm doing a biography now of a rather unknown American lawyer named Roy Cohn. Now, Roy Cohn, when he was 24 years old, was the chief counsel to Senator Joe McCarthy in 1954. And he was a scoundrel. He destroyed many lives. He was a political radical in the McCarthy era. And then afterwards, he moves back to New York City, and he becomes the chief counsel to all 5 mob families, the mafioso of New York City. And then in 1973, he's sitting at a dinner club in Manhattan, and at the next table is a young real estate developer named Donald Trump. And they strike up a conversation, and Trump explains that the U.S. government is suing him for discrimination against African Americans. And he asks Roy Cohn for his legal advice, and Roy says, well, I'll tell you what you should do. You should countersue the government and sue them for defamation for $100 million, which Trump does. He liked this advice. So Roy Cohn is the man who molded Donald Trump, taught him how to lie, how to not pay his taxes, how to always countersue, how to deal with the press. He molded the man that we see as a demagogue in American politics today.
What's the biography going to be titled?
The working title now is American Scoundrel.
यो किताब त नेपालमा पो लेख्नु पर्यो। नेपालमा अहिले जीवनी भनेको डाक्टर भेगबहादुर थापा, सूर्यबहादुर थापा, हरिबहादुर थापाले लेखेको सबै राजनीतिक व्यक्तित्वहरू हामीले चिने जानेको नेताहरूको बारेमा छ, तर चोरहरूको बारेमा कसैले पनि जीवनी लेखेको छैन। अब हाम्रो पनि पालो आए जस्तो छ। I think we should also be writing a Nepali scoundrel as a book. अब काई र म यो प्रश्न उत्तरको समय हामी तल आउँछौँ र उभिन्छौँ। त्यो भने हामी अलिकति आत्मीयतासित प्रश्न उत्तर गर्न सक्छौँ। एकैछिन धैर्यका साथ हामी उभिएर आउँछौँ। को पहिले?
Thank you, Kunda sir. So, let me ask you about this. Why there is iconization about this what inventor of the WMD? In South Asia, you wrote about this Oppenheimer. In South Asia also, Abdul Kalam, Abdul Qadir Khan, we iconized them, right? Generally, but these are the weapons of the mass destruction. But what's your take on this WMD? And second, there is a current of the opinion for the abolition of this WMD. And what's your opinion on this particular movement for the abolitions of this weapons of mass destruction?
You want to go?
Not sure.
Why were the inventors of atomic weapons, Abdul Kalam in India, Oppenheimer in America, why are they idolized and iconized?
Right. Yes, very good question. Well, I think the simple answer is that, we globally, everywhere now, we live in societies drenched in science and technology. And our world is changing very rapidly. We're on the cusp of a new scientific revolution with artificial intelligence that is going to change our economies, our lives. And this world is being changed for us by scientists. Now, yes, Oppenheimer and others lent their expertise to developing these weapons of mass destruction. But Oppenheimer always did so believing that, you cannot stop science. You cannot stop science. Human beings are animals that have an enormous curiosity about the physical world, and they're going to discover it. So you cannot stop the science. Now, in the case of Oppenheimer, he was motivated to build this weapon because he knew that the German scientists were working on this, and he feared that they would give the bomb to Hitler and that fascism would triumph in World War II. So this was his own motivation. And I think, Pakistan scientists had the same motivation. They knew India was getting it. Scientists in Israel had the same calculations. It's very unfortunate.
Is AI our new Oppenheimer moment?
Well, actually, Sam Altman, one of the developers of ChatGPT, refers to this moment as the Oppenheimer moment. Now, what he means is that scientists like Oppenheimer in 1945 had a moment where they were trying to convince the public, but also the politicians, about how to deal with this new technology, and warned them that, we need to regulate it. We need to make rules and regulations on how to, and in the same way, I think artificial intelligence needs to be managed. It needs to be humanized. We need to enforce privacy laws. We need to make sure that our words are not being taken freely. So actually, I am part of a class action suit. I'm suing Microsoft because they scanned my books to teach artificial ChatGPT how to write. They didn't ask my permission. So me and a handful of other biographers are suing Microsoft and a few of the other big tech companies. I don't know what's going to happen, but privacy should be regulated. So this is an Oppenheimer moment.
Thank you. It's an honor to witness such a vivid conversation. Thank you, Kunda Dai. Thank you, Kai, for coming here and making us feel alive. When I read biographies here, they are very much polished, garnished, and the main character of the biography are always iconized. So as you talked about the nature of the Oppenheimer, you yourself mentioned he was a man with many complex emotion. So you went through a lot of emotions, a range of emotions. As a writer, how difficult was it to translate those emotions, keeping truth and the organic side of the Oppenheimer alive? How difficult was it as a writer?
It was very difficult. It took a long time. Biography is very difficult. You have to tell stories, and you're choosing which stories to tell. You can't tell everything. And you have to tell stories that capture the complexity of this very intense human being, but you have to make sure that every quotation, every fact has a footnote. And, you tell the story more or less chronologically, but, the American Prometheus starts out with a story from 1954 when he's about to be put on trial. And it's a story about how he is so shocked at the accusations of disloyalty that are being waged against him in this letter of indictment that he has a physical collapse. He collapses in a bathroom, and his wife hears him fall down, and they can't open the door. His unconscious body is blocking the bathroom door. And we start the book with that because we wanted to start with something that grabs the reader and shows Oppenheimer, this historic, iconic figure, as a frail human being, someone who can feel the humiliation of being charged with disloyalty. And so it's important to convey the emotion, but it's also important that you have many, many footnotes.
Well, while Kai, you were answering the first question, I just went to ChatGPT and I just I was like, I'm with Kai, but what question should I ask to him? I just did that. And I just want to read out that question to you. So ChatGPT is asking you, how do you see, what's the challenge for readers, like biography readers? What's the challenge? So I'll just read out it. How do you see the balance between readers and who has less social media, who has less attention span due to social media? So it's a question asked by ChatGPT, but I want to relate it in that way. How do you see this thing coming up? Like you just said, no, right?
Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand. What did ChatGPT, what was the question?
ChatGPT is asking you, how do you see the reading, the new future of reading, when people have less social media span?
Oh, future of reading. Well, that's rather an obnoxious question from ChatGPT. I'm hopeful that we are all readers, and unfortunately, all of us have iPhones these days, and the iPhones give us little snippets of reading, and they take away much of our time for just sitting alone in a room or on a balcony overlooking the lake and reading for several hours. And that experience, I think, is still very important. You cannot convey, books are the best means of conveying deep thought and information and history and science. And you can't get it just from a few paragraphs on TikTok or or X, or the former Twitter. You need to read books, and I would argue that biography is a seductive way, a pleasurable way to read and to acquire information about history and the real world around us. So I don't know if ChatGPT will accept that answer, but
I'm sure he'll record it. Thank you, Kai Bird, for your time. अनि ध्यान दिएर सुनिदिनु भएकोमा र सोधिदिनु भएकोमा सबैजनालाई धन्यवाद। जय होस्।